Hello, it's Janet Murray from janetmurray.co.uk, and you're listening to the 360 Entrepreneur podcast with Jan Ilunga.
This is episode 224, and this one is all about PR and getting press coverage as a business owner. Here we go.
Welcome to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast, the show for entrepreneurs and small business owners who dream big and want to do bigger. Join some of the world's top entrepreneurs, internet marketers, and best-selling authors as they share their inspiring stories, their struggles, and give actionable tips that will help you build, grow, and promote your online business. Here's your host, Yanni Lunga.
Hi, and welcome to episode 224. Like always, you know me by now, Yanni Lunga. If you don't know me and it's your first time listening, welcome. I'm thrilled to have you here. And you being here is the right move if you have a business and are interested in getting exposure. And I'm talking about press coverage specifically. Many business owners, marketers, coaches, authors, entrepreneurs really work hard in trying to get press coverage. But why? What can press coverage do for your business, number one? And number two, what are some of the things to think about and do to not only get press coverage, but make sure that that has an impact on your business? Well, we're going to address those questions with today's guest expert. Janet Murray is a very popular PR coach, author, speaker, and podcaster, and she's here with us. The show notes page for today's episode can be found over at yannilunga.com/episode 224. All right, it's time to get started. Here's the interview with Janet Murray from janetmurray.co.uk. I'm really excited about who's here with us today. She's an author, podcaster, and PR expert who helps entrepreneurs and small business owners leverage PR to create buzz around their business. She's the author of the book, Your Press Release is Breaking My Heart, a total unconventional guide to selling your story in the media, and she's the host of the Soulful PR podcast. I'm really ready to rock this episode alongside my friend, Janet Murray. Janet, how's it going?
Good, thank you. And thanks for such an amazing intro. You make me sound very accomplished. So thank you.
Well, it is all you. I simply read some of the things you do. So you should just, give yourself kudos because that's all you, Janet. And I said, I'm really excited about having you here because you're somebody who had been on my radar for quite some time. And a few months ago, we chatted for your podcast, the Soulful PR podcast. And now you're here and I'm really excited about the topic of the episode. And I know that PR is really your bread and butter. I know you do other things as well, but I guess PR is really what you focus on. And I think before we dive into today's content, I have to ask you, Janet, in case there is somebody joining us who has no idea who the chief of Soulful PR is, could you take a moment to tell them a little bit more about what you do with Soulful PR?
Yes, so I'm Janet Murray and I'm actually a PR expert who's never worked in PR, but more on that in a second. So I've spent the last 16 years writing and editing for national newspapers and magazines in the UK. And that basically, I spotted something early on when I was mainly freelance for most of the time. And my job basically would be to come up with ideas to pitch to editors. And I was also at the same time being pitched to by PR companies and people who wanted to get into the media, who wanted me to write things for them. And I noticed something very early on, which has really led to what I'm doing today. And what I noticed is that people were dreadful at pitching into the media. So as a journalist, my inbox would be just full of the most dreadful press releases and pitches by people who hadn't bothered to read the publication or program that they were hoping I might be able to help them to get into. And they were often very ill thought out. But the thing that really stood out for me is that often they came from PR companies or so-called like PR experts. And what really galled me, because I've always really run my own business, they were often from people like myself who'd hired a PR company, in good faith that they would help them to get exposure, and they were sending out these dreadful press releases and pitches that nobody would ever be interested in a million years. And I want to say at this point, and I'm sure I will say it again later, but there are some great PR people out there, but it is an industry where there is some bad practice, and it's easy to get kind of swept up and caught out if you don't know what you're looking for, basically. So this kind of inspired me. I thought to myself, well, if there's people out there who are practicing in PR, but they don't really know what a story is, and they don't know how to pitch to a journalist in the most effective way, well, why don't I teach them? So I started off kind of running these like workshops, and eventually that grew into big conferences. And all the time, this was actually just to subsidize my journalism, because journalism isn't the best paid career in the world. It's all very well to tell people that you write for The Guardian and it's very prestigious, but actually you get paid, per penny per word. I'm not saying it's a penny a word, but 30p a word, 40p a word, and that doesn't add up to a great salary at the end of the year. So I've always sort of subsidized my income by doing consultancy and training. I used to be a school teacher, and so it was kind of an entrepreneurial mindset. I thought, if these people don't know how to do it, I'll go out and teach them. So these workshops and masterclasses, they sort of grew and grew, and I started doing big conference events where I'd get journalist friends of mine to come along and talk about what they were looking for. And then I kind of got to the point where I was a little bit bored of journalism. So I felt like, this sounds awful to say, but when I first started out, I was like, oh my God, if I could just get to write for The Guardian regularly, that would be amazing. But actually, I was there, I was doing it. I was also filling in as an editor on a few different sections. But I felt a bit, you just get a bit burnt out, and you're just like, I think I've had enough of this now. And if someone else asks me to write another article and I have to go through the same, it becomes almost like working in a factory kind of thing. So I think I was looking for a new challenge, but didn't really know what it was. So I thought, well, I'll try and get some more of this nice consultancy work. People would book me to do writing training or to do radio and TV training or pitching training or whatever. And so I started this blog about 5 years ago. And in this blog, I didn't know that what I was doing was content marketing, but I just thought, well, if I start a blog and I answer people's questions, the things that people ask me all the time, then they will see that I'm knowledgeable about my subject, and they will find this stuff online. I mean, I didn't know anything about search engine optimization or anything. I was just like, oh, I'm going to start this blog. And then they will book me to do this consultancy. So that worked. I could see that writing this blog, and to be honest, it wasn't very good to start off with, but I was answering people's questions like, how do I write a press release? Where do I send my press release to? How do I find journalist contact details? What do I say in an email pitch? How do I, should I pitch journalists over Twitter or whatever? So basically just answering those questions. And so I got into that and started to really enjoy it. And then rather than just kind of playing around with content marketing, I sort of learned that that's what I was doing, and then tried to get better at it. And then I just got really interested in working with small business owners, because as a small business owner and kind of entrepreneurial type myself, as I said, I'd kind of started this journey with me seeing small business owners, basically I felt being a bit ripped off and hiring PR companies for something that they could probably do themselves and do much better. I just thought, well, why don't I teach it to them instead? So I gradually kind of pivoted my offer, and basically where we are today is where I was kind of delivering this kind of training and content to sort of corporates and not-for-profits and that kind of thing. I'm pretty much now entirely helping small business owners and entrepreneurs to tell their story in the media, so to get coverage in magazines, newspapers, radio and TV. But because PR in itself, maybe I should have started with this, a lot of people are confused about what it actually is. I tend to think of it as kind of press coverage, but in my book, actually, I talk about it as being really anything to do with the way that you promote your business. So that might be content, that might be blog content or podcast, or it might be YouTube channel, whatever. It's email marketing, it's what you do on social media, it's even how you look, how you pick up the phone, how you answer emails. To me, it's like everything about your business. But so I guess what I specialize in is press, but I also now help people with all sorts of aspects of how they promote their business, because I think it's difficult just to kind of just look at press. I help people in different ways. So I've got a podcast, which is the Soulful PR podcast. I still write on the blog, which is at janetmurray.co.uk. I now have a Twitter hour on a Sunday evening, which people can jump on and ask questions, and that's going really well. I've got a big free Facebook community called the Soulful PR Facebook community. So that's all my free places you can go and get help with all of this stuff. And then my main focus is I've got a membership community called the Soulful PR Studio. And that's where I help people over a longer period of time. So people who are really looking, I mean, we don't just do press, we also do content marketing and email marketing and social as well. But, it's like the whole package together. So I help people with that. Got about 250 members in there at the moment. I also do a little bit of one-to-one coaching as well. And as you mentioned, I don't probably promote this much on my website, but if people want to book me for writing training, or I do lots of speaking, I'm speaking at Chris Ducker's Youpreneur Summit in the autumn, speaking at Content Marketing Academy. So yeah, does that kind of give you a bit of an idea as to how I work with people and the journey that I've taken?
Yeah, and what is interesting, as I was listening to you, Janet, I was like, yeah, and you thanked me for the introduction at the beginning, and it's like, you have been doing so many things. And I like the fact that you said, I'm a PR expert who actually has never worked for a PR firm. And I really like the fact that you talked about how many people go into outsourcing publicity, PR, and they say, well, yeah, just hire this person who is a pro and he or she is going to take care of me. And as you said, there are so many companies, agency, people who call themselves PR professionals who actually don't do a very good job at that. And for example, for me, something I've seen so many times that every single email like that I got, I was like, oh man, is for my music podcast, the Jazz Spotlight. I have it on the website that I don't do any music reviews on that podcast. I don't talk about albums. I don't give reviews on albums and things like that. And you have no idea, Janet, how many emails I've gotten from publicists who are like, yeah, I represent this person. Are you interested in talking about her or his album on the show? And I'm like, didn't you take 30 seconds to read the webpage where it clearly states that that's exactly what I don't do? So it's unfortunate because, as you said, those people are actually paid to try and get the PR. And sometimes they go about it the wrong way, which is unfortunate. But I'm happy you are here, because I'm sure you're going to have some good advice for us that we can implement, whether we want to go about PR by ourselves or we want to outsource that. We're going to have some things to think about. And you said early on, Janet, that for you, PR is really anything that has to do with the way you present yourself and your business online and offline.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that, in the past, we might have talked about PR as just being press, but I think it's getting increasingly difficult to kind of separate that from things like content marketing and guest blogging and email marketing and social. And the biggest sort of, I guess, mistake that I see small businesses making. So often I'll get people approaching me saying, hey, can you help me get into the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Sydney Morning Herald? And then I'll go and have a look at their website, and they're not creating content regularly. So they're not blogging, they're not podcasting, they're not building an email list, they're not very active on social media. So actually, I think it's really important. I see like press as the kind of fourth stage with my membership community. This is how I work with people. I say, okay, let's get some content locked down so you're creating regular content. Let's get you starting to build up your email list. Let's get you active on social media and posting and having conversations about the right sort of things, because then the press will deliver for you. But if you try and skip those steps and you try and go straight to the, oh, I want to be in Marie Claire magazine, or I want to be in the New Yorker or whatever, then not only is that probably not very realistic, because you're not really an expert, you're not really anything, when journalists look you up, they're probably not going to be that keen to speak to you. But also you get more bang for your buck, basically. So I've got an example actually that I sometimes share on webinars of an article that I had in The Guardian, which did really well. It was about why women shouldn't work for free. It was an opinion article about being asked to speak for free. And I can talk more about, you might think, well, why is that a good piece of PR for me? I can talk about that a little bit more later, but that got a really decent amount of shares, and it got a lot of engagement online, but the comments were only available for a couple of days for some reason. But I was able to get that in front of 25 times more people, because I have an email list, because I have 23,000 followers on Twitter, because I've got a big Facebook community. And I think that's the important bit, is that I think with anything to do with promoting your business, if you only focus on one thing, and you don't think about, it's almost like a kind of 360 podcast, it's like
Right.
you need to be kind of firing on all cylinders, and these things need to complement each other. So the work that your press work needs to complement your blogging and your email marketing and your social media, and it's all kind of working together. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, it absolutely does. First of all, I mean, the steps you mentioned to start, first of all, to have a kind of library of content, have your website that is ready to go, an email list, as some type of social media presence. I think it makes perfect sense. And I think it's very important also because that if our site is not, let's say, ready, sure, we may end up being featured on whatever site, but what that really does, if we don't have anything that, if we don't have a strategy behind it, as you said, is pretty useless. I mean, yeah, we can say I was featured on whatever publication, but that's pretty much it. On the other hand, if we have our platform that is ready to go, maybe we can use something to, for example, create a landing page to try to get traffic from the specific article, or anyways, we have different pieces of content, different things on our site that maybe somebody who is reading the article on the publication and our name doesn't tell them anything, they go and check our website, they start to read some articles or listen to podcasts, and it's like, oh wow, this Janet gal sounds somebody that I should connect with, or I should reach out and see if I can work with her, or if she can help me, or something like that, right?
And ideally you're an avid email marketer. We were just having a little bit of a geek out before we got on this call about some of our email marketing strategies, weren't we? But ideally, those of us who run online businesses, our aim really is we want to get people to our, if we have a podcast or whatever, we want to get people back to our site so we can keep in touch with them, and we ideally want to be able to collect their email address so that we can keep in touch with them. So if people, they read your article on Entrepreneur and they think that's great and they come to your site, but you don't have a mechanism for which you can collect their email address, and obviously in order to do that you need to be giving them a nice valuable piece of content, a download or a video series or whatever, then they're just going to click away and they may never come back again. So I think this is why it's really important that you've got these other key pieces in place. The other reason as well is that journalists, and we can talk more about this, but they're much more interested in people than products, or they're much more interested in people than podcasts. So they're less likely to want to write an article or to do a piece about your podcast. They might be much more interested in your personal story or your standing as an expert. So journalists use things like Twitter a lot. They use Twitter as a search engine, basically. So say, for example, I'm writing an article about podcasting. I mean, this is happening a lot to me now. I think the traditional media is getting a lot more interested in podcasting and talking more to podcasters and getting their opinion about stuff. So if, in your case, Jan, so say, for example, I'm writing a piece on big podcasting trends or something like that, and I look you up and you say you're a podcasting expert, but when I look at your Twitter feed, you're not sharing any content about podcasting, or you haven't put anything on your blog about podcasting, or you're not over on LinkedIn talking about it or whatever, then I'm probably going to think, no, I'll go and find someone else, because I think journalists, they're looking for that go-to person, aren't they? They're looking for, like we all are, you want to go to the expert. You don't want to go to somebody who does a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Ideally, right. If you're doing a piece on podcasting, you want somebody who's, or you're doing a piece about, about music. You want to go to somebody if somebody's got a music podcast, then you want to find somebody who's regularly sharing content about music. And as an editor myself, so if I'm looking for somebody to write something for me, and increasingly journalists are looking for people to write the content because they're working on shoestring budgets, which is bad news for people like me who used to make my whole living through freelance writing, right. But it's good news for business owners. So increasingly they're looking for people to write content, like full articles for them. So the first thing I'm going to do, if you send me a pitch, is I'm going to go over and have a look at what you've written before. If you're writing a blog and I can see that you can string a sentence together and you can hang an argument together, and I'm not going to have to spend like hours editing it, then you're in, But if I go and I see that you haven't posted on your blog for 6 months, or in the case of radio and TV, if I go and check you out on LinkedIn and there isn't any video of you, if I'm a radio or TV producer, I just want to check that you're all right. I don't want want, polished kind of like TV footage, but, just a little bit of video of you talking about, what you do, and just to check that you're okay and you're not going to fall apart on there. So I think it's just thinking about, before you even start reaching out to the press, it's actually thinking about, well, what, they're actively looking for people like you. So making it easy, that would be my first step actually, is, getting things in place so it's easy for journalists to find you. And when they do find you, they understand what you're all about and how you can help them. Does that kind of help as a kind of first step?
Yeah, thank you for that, Janet. I think it absolutely does. And what I really like about that first step you just shared with us is that those are things that we should be doing anyways. So it's great because if we create content on a regular basis, for example, if we share that content on our go-to social media platforms, you mentioned Twitter, LinkedIn being very popular among journalists, we're going to be attracting the right people, the right listeners if you have a podcast, the right reader, the right prospects, clients, and journalists. So I really like, because what you share with us, Janet, is not something that, okay, we should do it and we have to do it because it works and it's useful only for PR, but it's something that is very useful for a brand, for our business, regardless of whether we really want to tackle PR or not, right?
Yeah, people need to understand what we do and what we're about. And just to give you an example, actually, I posted on LinkedIn the other day because I was looking, I'm desperate to find somebody to interview on my podcast about LinkedIn. I want a go-to expert who can talk to me about LinkedIn. And think about the Soulful PR podcast, because it's PR. I think my listeners, they quite like people who've got kind of like nice looking brands, consistently good images and nice looking website and that kind of thing. So I posted up on LinkedIn saying, look, I'm looking for a go-to person. And by that, I mean somebody who's either got a podcast about LinkedIn or a blog, or maybe they've got a book, but somebody who is consistently posting about LinkedIn. I almost wish I hadn't posted it because I got about 70 replies and people were suggesting people, and I was immediately dismissing everybody who did a little bit of this and that. So if I went to their website and I saw that they were like a social media expert, then I would immediately dismiss them. If they were saying, well, I did a little bit of LinkedIn training. No, I want the person who every blooming blog post they write is about LinkedIn. I want this person who lives and breathes LinkedIn. And I think it's the same. And it's a scary thing to do. It's the same for journalists. That's what they're looking for. So I think the more clear you can be about, what you're the go-to person for and what you can really, really help them with, then the more likely they are going to be to reach out to you. And that's kind of where I'd start. And then once you've done that, I can walk you through, a few kind of other easy steps to take as well. Do you want me to walk you through a few other kind of basics?
Yes, please, absolutely.
So the second step is, so I say, go after the low-hanging fruit. Don't make things more difficult than they need to be. Okay, so first of all, it's about making sure that it's really clear what you do and how you can help journalists, and what is it your expertise is, or what your product is, or whatever it is that you do. So secondly, there's lots of ways that you can get coverage without writing a press release, without writing a pitch. All you need to do is just be online and answer some messages or answer some emails. So the first one, this applies to, I don't know how many listeners you've got in the UK, so I'll just quickly whiz through this one. But we have a hashtag in the UK called Journo Request, and journalists from quite high profile titles will just post on that hashtag to say what they're looking for. Loads of my clients have just basically replied on Twitter and have been featured in some really high profile, Telegraph, Times, Daily Mail, Psychology's magazine, Glamour, some really big UK titles, just by replying to tweets. And a little tip I would give you, because there are, depending on where you are in the world, there will be things like this as well. Journalists are actively looking for help with stories. Is don't dismiss things. If you see something and think, well, what's that got to do with my business? Don't dismiss it immediately, because remember, this is a long-term game, and this is about making relationships for the long term. So you might help a journalist out on a story that you can help them out with, but you can't immediately think how that's going to help your business. But remember that when you do have a story you want to go to with them, then you've kicked the door open and you've got their attention. So it's much easier to go back and say, do you remember I helped you out with that request on Twitter? And they're much more like, it's much harder to say. It's easy to say no to a stranger, I often say, but if you've had a bit of interaction with somebody, it's harder to ignore them or say no to them. So the other things that are really worth looking at, and I imagine that lots of you will know about this already, but even though people know about them, they don't use them. And I think you're mad if you don't use these opportunities. But these are media inquiry services. So these are basically services where journalists, again, from really high profile publications, will post up requests about things that they're looking for help with. So the big one that most people seem to know is Help a Reporter Out, HARO, which is US based. Mm-hmm. Then there's Source Bottle, which is pretty good. That's international. I think it maybe started in Australia. The UK, we have Response Source, which is probably the biggest, and it's my preferred one in the UK. There's Gorkana in the UK. We've got something called JournoLink, Ace Media. So do some research to see what else is out there. And it literally is this easy. So they're either free completely, or they certainly give you a free trial so you can try out and see what works for you. But you sign up, you pick the categories that you want to be informed about, so that the subjects that you think you've got something to say, or you've got products or services that are kind of relevant, and you just wait for the emails to come into your inbox. And in my case, I subscribe to Response Source. Every day I get requests from the Daily Mail, from the Daily Telegraph, from the BBC, from Channel 4, from some really big news outlets, and I just reply to the emails. It's that easy. And some of them go somewhere, not all of them do, but if you bear in mind that it would cost you tens of thousands to take out a page ad in a national newspaper, I think you'd be kind of mad not to take those opportunities. I was at the Daily Mail yesterday in London doing a photo shoot, and that's going to be a 2-page spread in the paper on Saturday. And, that would cost me thousands for that kind of exposure. But I just replied to an email and I fitted the bill. And, so what normally happens when people subscribe to these services, they say, oh, duh, well, I'm getting loads of emails now, aren't I? And they get really cross about it. And I'm like, well, hang on a minute. And one of my clients put this so well, but she subscribed. This lady called Dipti Tate, she's a hypnotherapist, and she subscribed recently to this Response Source. And in a week, she got coverage in Psychologies, I think it was, The Sun, the Daily Mail, basically about 5 or 6 really high-profile UK publications. And she felt like everybody else. She got a lot of emails at first. She felt a bit overwhelmed. She wasn't sure how she was going to manage them. But instead of complaining about it, she said, okay, right, I'm going to make a separate inbox for them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check in the morning. I'm going to check in the afternoon, because journalists work very quickly, and generally, you need to get on things ASAP, basically. Right. And she basically, just kind of managed her time. And she also said something to me which really stuck in my head. She said, these are not annoying emails. They are leads. They're potential leads for my business to be featured in national publications. So, I don't need to be complaining about this. These are opportunities. So I would say start with that, because not only can you get started for free and you can see what works for you, but you just learn so much. You can collect the names and email addresses of different journalists on publications you might want to appear in. You get to understand about timing, so you get to understand why are journalists asking about this particular topic now, how quickly do they work, when they do come back to me, what sort of things are they asking me. You'll quickly get a sense of, often they're just asking for comments, so they're just asking for a few paragraphs, so they might want to interview over the phone, but sometimes it might be they want you to write something. So you'll get to understand a little bit about just what it's like dealing with journalists. And I like to see this as your training ground. So, and in my book, this is what I suggest you do, is that you do these things first, and then once you've got a little bit of experience and you think, okay, I know how to work with journalists now, then you start doing the outreach bit. I mean, you can start the outreach straight away, but I think people generally get on better if they do a little bit of this first. So that's my second tip. So do you want me to now talk about, how you actually kind of reach out with an idea of your own?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we do that though, Janet, a quick reminder to everybody joining us that, like in every episode, I'm going to add the links to everything we're talking about here in the show notes. So all the sites you mentioned that people can start leveraging right now, everything, including obviously Janet's website, janetmurray.co.uk. You can find it in the show notes. All right, Janet. So let's keep going. When it comes to reaching out and pitching, what do you have for us?
Okay, so I would say don't worry too much about press releases, because journalists get tons of press releases, and journalists are good at finding people to talk to, and they're generally good at pulling a story together. So don't bust a gut over writing press releases. They do have their place, but actually, if you've got an idea for a publication or program you want to be featured in, an email is fine. But I probably ought to just sort of backpedal a bit and say the biggest mistake people make when it comes to getting in touch with the media is so simple, you almost just couldn't believe that this happens. But you mentioned it happened to you for your podcast before, and it happens to me too. But people will pitch to a magazine or newspaper or radio or TV show that they haven't watched or listened to or read.
Right.
And it just, to me, it just seems like, as a journalist, it was just like, how could you, like you said, they clearly hadn't, not even listened to the podcast, but even like gone and done some research and looked at a few episode titles or whatever. But it seems to me it's really rude, isn't it? To sort of, if you imagine journalists, they're in a really good position here because they're the ones who've got the space or the airtime, and they're the decision makers, and you can't even be bothered to, it seems, to actually just read what it is that they do. So I would suggest that you spend most of your time on this. So basically, if it's a print publication, just bear in mind, people often ask me what's the difference between print and online, and there's not really any difference because most stuff goes online now anyway. But buy the magazine. It's often easier to sort of case it out if you actually have the print version, and sit down and just write down what you see on every page. Now, this might sound a little bit basic and a bit arduous, but I promise you, if you do this, it will save you so much time and wasted effort. Because basically, I think if you don't work in the media, you imagine that somehow a magazine sit down and they go, oh, what should we do this month? But there's actually a very rigid structure. So you'll find that there's probably a set number of features. There's probably, a set number of interviews, a set number of opinion articles or roundups. So you might notice there's a tech review page or there's a whatever. But it's only when you sit down and you really look at it that you'll start to see those patterns. And what you're looking to do is to be able to kind of get to the stage where you can say, I've got this idea I thought what would work for your tech page. That's how specific you really want to get. Or I've got this idea that I think would work for this show. Or I've got this idea that I think would work really well for this segment of your show. So you're really showing your research. And, I get it all the time with my podcast as well. And people, they pitch me ideas and they clearly have, they say, oh, I love your podcast. It's absolutely amazing. And then they pitch some like really like balmy ideas. And if you're not from the UK, that just means mad ideas. You might not have heard that before. But really kind of just like mad ideas that I would never, ever run. And it's clear they've not even, ideally you'd want to listen to it, but, they've not even looked at the list of episodes. So we just go back to them and say, can you have a look at the list of the episodes and maybe come back with some ideas that are a little bit more, on topic. So that immediately puts you streets ahead if it shows that you've actually taken the time to research it. So that's the first thing. When it comes to your email, so as a busy journalist, I did an editing stint recently at The Guardian. I covered for an editor for 3 weeks. And I'll just tell you, I'm not untypical in this, but I don't open most of the emails I get because you just get so many. There's so many people competing for space. There's so many press releases. So what grabs my attention is if it's labelled up story idea or pitch even, just so because basically journalists, they are looking for content. So you see that, you think, great, okay, somebody's actually taken the time to put something together for me and think about something that might work for my publication or programme. So don't send the same thing out to everybody. Just think about, you might have the same idea, but you might tweak it slightly for different programmes, publications, because they're all different, they'll have different audiences. So in your subject header, you summarise, what your idea might be. So the example I often give, just because it's got a good pun example in it, is, but let's say, for example, I don't know, you run a surfwear company. Your temptation might be to have something like, companies surfing the wave of fashion, because you think that sounds clever, but actually to a busy journalist, they'd have no idea what you're going on about. So if you if your story was about the fact that your surfing company was giving away free swimming shorts or something, that's not a very exciting story. But if that was your story, that's that's basically what you need to put in the subject header. Get straight to the point. So in your email, get straight in. As I was wondering if you'd be interested in a story about bang, get straight to the idea. Don't spend 3 paragraphs giving the background of your history and your mum and your cat or whatever, which is what lots of people do. And just informal conversational style. Imagine you were telling a friend. That's probably about the right pitch. I've got a fantastic even though I say myself, I've got a fantastic blog post which actually breaks it down for you step by step, and it's got pictures and everything about what to put in each bit, and it's called How to Write Emails Journalists Will Actually Read. So if you want to link to that in the show notes, I've got clients who just come back to that time and time again. So that's the really key thing. And another thing, if I've got time, just to mention about the sort of ideas that work, is it's not about you, basically. And your podcast pitch, that was a perfect example, is that I got a really bad podcast pitch from somebody yesterday, and what was bad about it was all about them. It wasn't about how they could help my audience. Like, what I want is somebody who's looked at the show. Ideally, they've listened to a little bit, just maybe listen to a bit of an episode or something to get the idea, but they've looked at the actual kind of episodes, they've looked at the kind of people that I interview, and they're trying to think about my audience. What would my audience find useful? I've actually created a blog post, if people care to look, which is about how to pitch yourself as a podcast guest, and in it I actually say this is what I'm looking for my show, and I'm looking for ideally somebody who's written a book about the subject, or a podcast, a real expert where I can send people on to learn more, basically. So a great pitch for me is when the person's thinking about my audience and they're thinking about how can they provide content that my audience are either going to find helpful or going to entertain them, or just it's all about them. But I think where people go wrong with pitches, and this is not even just the pitch, just the idea, it's all about them, and it's all about how amazing they are, and who wants to read about that. So it's really who wants to hear about that on a radio TV show. So what's often more interesting is the areas of your life that intersect with your business. So I've got this image that I often share with my students, which is it's like a Venn diagram, and in the middle of it, it's got your business and brand, and then around the sides of it, it's got different areas of your life that intersect with your business. So relationships, work, family. What else has it got? Hobbies. So it's got sort of various, parts of your life that intersect. Now, people are much more interested in that kind of stuff than they are in your business generally, unless you're doing something really, really amazingly like different or whatever. So, the fact that you've got a podcast is not a story. The fact that you have a business is not a story, though often lots of people think it is. So some of my best pieces of press coverage have been, so for example, I work in a shed at the end of my garden, which is very pretty, and I've been featured in various national publications talking about this shed that I work in. Now, you might think, well, what's that got to do with your business? But actually, it's a great old opportunity for me to say, oh, well, I work from home, this is the kind of business that I run, and this is what I do here, whatever. So it's absolutely fine. I mentioned earlier that I had a piece in The Guardian about why women needed to stop working for free. That sends me so many leads. It's untrue. Which you would, because and in it I'm talking about being asked to speak at events. So people will email and say, will you speak at this event? I'll say, yes, that sounds lovely. What sort of fee did you have in mind? And they're like, oh, I thought you'd do it for the exposure. And those kind of articles work because not only is it like 1,200 words for me to advertise essentially that I'm a speaker, you can book me to speak, but also it's a topic that people actually care about. So people care about it, people have opinions about it, and I think you need to take this when you're thinking of ideas to pitch into the press. You need to have your content marketing head on, basically. You need to be thinking, is it shareable? Would people actually care about this? Would they retweet it? Would they Facebook it? Would they tell their friends? So I'll often say to people, run the Facebook test past it. So if you've got an idea that you'd like to pitch to a journalist, think to yourself, okay, if I posted this on my personal Facebook wall, would people be interested? Would they like it? That's moderately interesting. Would they comment on it? Then that's possibly more interesting. Would they share it? Now we're definitely getting more interesting. But the real kind of like the acid test is, would they be divided about it? And I'm not saying like, would they be divided like, like scrapping with each other about it, but would people have different opinions about it? And that's generally the kind of like thermometer when it comes to what's going to be of interest. So that's the problem with this. Obviously, it's the opposite of what most, if I say to people, what kind of coverage do you want in the press? Well, I just want journalists to write about how wonderful my business is or how wonderful my podcast is. But actually, they're just interested in doing that. So it's about kind of thinking about, what are you doing in your business, or what could you do in your business that people would want to talk about? So an example I often give is that there's a chocolatier in the UK, so a chocolate maker, and she made a a chocolate bunny for Easter in the shape of Benedict Cumberbatch, the Sherlock Holmes actor, and sent it to his mum for Easter. And you're like, well, that's interesting. That's different. That it's, there was a big business story recently about a guy that I think he was letting his staff choose how many holidays they could have as many holidays as they wanted over the course of a year or something. So it's just about that kind of, what would people actually want to talk about? So that's your kind of story stuff. At the same time, you might be thinking, oh my God, what if I, what could I possibly come up with? But then there's also a massive appetite for how-to content. So would you like to know what my best piece of PR content is in terms of sending traffic to my site and sending me customers?
Well, I don't know. Let me think.
It's a very, very, in my eyes, it's quite a dull article for The Guardian about how to write a press release, and I don't even like press releases. I wrote a book about how I don't like press releases. But what I recognised was that actually people who don't know much about PR, often they have heard of press releases, and so they might Google that. So if I can teach them how to write that, then they may well come to my website, and then once they're there and they're in my funnel, if you like, I can then teach them some things which are much easier than writing press releases. But that's just a bog standard article that I've written about a million times in different ways. I've written a version for Entrepreneur, I've written a version for Huffington Post. So there's a huge appetite for that kind of content. So when it comes to podcasters, I don't know do you know the podcaster Colin Gray, who's based in Scotland?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he was here on the show a few months ago.
There you go. So I helped Colin to get a piece in The Guardian over in the UK. And basically, he came to me and said, "Look, I really want to raise the profile of podcasting. What can I do?" And I said, "Well, instead of kind of just saying journalists aren't going to write a story about how amazing podcasting is, but what they might be interested in is a practical how-to piece. So if you've got a business, is it worth starting a podcast? And what's the impact on the bottom line of your business?" So you wrote a kind of practical piece. So you're all creative people listening. I know you are. It's about approaching this with a really kind of creative mindset and almost having your content marketing head on, your kind of clickbaity, what's going to make people kind of share, what's going to make people engage, what's going to start a conversation. Journalists are very much thinking in the same way.
I love it. Thank you so much, Janet. I think you've given us so much actionable tips here. You told us different things we can think about, different angles we can go. So you talked about early on, you made the example of your story and the fact that you work from a quote unquote unusual office. You talked about the fact that we should really make everything we do about them, whether it's the publication, whether it's a podcaster, whoever we are reaching out to. We should make it about them. So our pitch should be tailored to them and how it may be interesting to their audience or to their readers. And we should be honest. And as you said, nobody really cares about how great we think our business is or our podcast is. So we should think about how something we do can be of interest to the publication and to other readers. And you said that may not be something we do kind of as our core. For example, in the article you mentioned of talking about your workspace, working spaces isn't something you talk about all the time, but at the same time, that allowed you to kind of get your name and face out there. And then, if somebody was like, interesting how this lady is working from the shed, and let me check out her website to learn more about what she does. And again, then people went back to your online hub. So I think that's great. And you said that, of course, if we feel like we don't have anything special, let's say, to share, then we could consider how-to content. You said the example of Colin you made is a great one. Is always publications are always looking for that type of content. I think if anybody here has checked out sites like Huffington Post, Entrepreneur Inc., you have come across some type of how-to content in your niche. So all that is great advice. And early on, Janet, you mentioned your Twitter. You are over at Jan_Murray. So that's JAN_MURRAY. I'll link to that in the show notes page as well. And then you also have the Facebook group. So the final question I have for you, Janet, is can you tell everybody a little bit more about what they can expect from your Facebook community?
So my Facebook community is just a great place to hang out if you want to learn more about how to promote your business. So, that might be press, which we've talked about a lot today, but it also might be content marketing. It might also be email marketing. It might be social media. It might be using events to promote your business or summits or whatever. So basically anything to do with promoting your business. I had a masterclass with my membership community the other day about styling for business, about what to wear and how that impacts on people. So basically anything about promoting your business and ultimately getting more sales and getting more customers, then that's what we're talking about over in the Soulful PR Facebook community.
Great. Thank you for taking us behind the scenes of what's happening in your Facebook group. I know I'm a member there, and I said you are on Twitter. Your site again is janetmurray.co.uk. I know there you have your blog, you have the podcast, you have the link to your book, different resources. So I'll make sure to link to everything we've covered in today's episode there so that you can go there and learn more and get in touch and connect with Janet Murray. Janet, thank you so much for joining us here today and sharing your Soulful PR tips with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we are back. You heard it. Getting press coverage is pretty useless unless you have a strategy in place. And Janet mentioned several resources. You can find the links, the recap of everything we've covered in today's conversation over at janilunga.com/224. And I also want to take back the curtain a little bit and let you know about the Podcast Success Summit 2017. The Podcast Success Summit is my online conference. It's the biggest digital conference about podcasting in the whole world. And here's the thing. I've been working really hard organizing this year's edition, and it's almost here. It's from September 18th to the 22nd, and you can expect an explosive edition. And I'm able to tell you this because I've recorded most interviews and panels of discussion already. This year's edition of the Podcast Success Summit is perfect for you if you have a podcast already, because we talk about growth, podcast marketing, impact, monetization, so all key areas in the growth of your podcasting journey. And guess what? Janet Murray, she's gonna be part of the Podcast Success Summit. And we've actually recorded our conversation already, and I can tell you, it's dynamite. During that conversation, we changed topic a little bit, and we didn't talk about getting press coverage, but we talked about pitching as a podcast host or guest. So if you conduct an interview-based show or you're interested in being featured on podcasts, then Janet's session on the Podcast Success Summit 2017 is definitely for you. I'm going to tell you more about the Podcast Success Summit next week. For now, I want to wrap things up with a final note. Unfortunately, I won't be at Podcast Movement this year. Some people asked me in the Podcast Growth Mastermind by email if I would head to Anaheim next week for Podcast Movement. Unfortunately, the answer is no. If you're planning on attending Podcast Movement and perhaps you don't know anybody, head over to the Podcast Growth Mastermind. The link to that it's in the show notes page as well, because there I've linked to a post and I've invited people who are attending Podcast Movement to comment. So you can actually break the ice and get to make friends even before you head to Podcast Movement 2017. So all that over at janilunga.com/episode 224. All right, time for me to go. This is it. Over and out.
Thank you for listening to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast. For more tips and tools, head over to www.janilunga.com.